Let's bring in Joe Michell, who is an Associate Professor of Economics at the University of the West of England from Bristol. Joe, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Sybil's package, her piece was from Berlin, from Germany, but this is by no means an isolated story. Is the global economy moving into uncharted waters?
I think we are in relatively uncharted waters. At the same time, I think it's relatively clear what needs to be done. We're in a situation of a supply shortage. There is less food, less available fuel, cost of getting those things is going up. So the only real solution here is some sort of redistribution. We need to find a way of ensuring that those people who have very little choice over their consumption needs, basic needs, food, heating and so on, are able to access those basic needs. Many people can't cut back on heating, they can't cut back on food expenditure, and that requires redistributional policies. Now, those are politically very difficult, which I think is why we're seeing a lot of difficult decisions at the moment all over the place, from individual governments wrangling internally over how distribution should be dealt with, to international problems as governments between themselves are thinking about mechanisms either to try and protect themselves and their own population, or what I would prefer to see is discussion about how we can see multilateral agreements and negotiations to try and spread this pain over the next year or two until we hopefully start to move away from the severe supply bottlenecks. Although I think we have to accept that with climate change, in particular, we're going to see more and more of this kind of thing, and that only adds to the urgency of sort of long-term planning for it, I think.
But much like with climate change, getting consensus across the board, across so many countries is extremely hard to achieve. How likely is it to get multilateral agreements in place quickly?
Absolutely right. I mean, it's one thing to say this is what we need, or this would happen in an ideal situation. It's completely another thing, the real world of politics and so on. And some of what we're seeing at the moment actually moving in the other direction. We're seeing countries starting to pull back. We're seeing some countries restricting exports of wheat, for example, and moving towards protectionism. So I think some agreements are very hard to come by. That said, we shouldn't stop making the case, for reform of the international financial system, for new mechanisms, I think, by which poorer countries, lower income countries can be given the space they need. Those are the countries who are really, people in those countries are going to be suffering a lot. We have seen some recent changes, which I think are quite positive. The IMF sounds very technical, but they have something called special drawing rights, which are a sort of money issued by the International Monetary Fund. They issued quite a lot, 650 billion new special drawing rights. And that's, a very positive kind of example of the kind of international cooperation that we can see. So I don't think it's out of the question, but as you say, it's politically very difficult.
And politically difficult as well is the fact that most governments are limited to a 4 or 5 year tenure, let's say, and perhaps these problems are more like 10-year or 15-year problems that need to be tackled. Governments only last a certain amount of time, and they've also got to get voted back in. So they're slightly caught between the short term and the long term, which makes it difficult to get things done.
Yeah, short-termism is inevitable as a consequence of democracy, unfortunately. Parliamentary cycles give us these kind of problems. I think it requires, in some sense, some smart thinking from people trying to construct institutional structures and mechanisms which, once in place, if they're doing the job which we need them to do, are harder to roll back. There are some things you can immediately switch off at an election. There are some things which are more difficult. So some kind of smart thinking on the parts of people who are trying to put forward institutional changes. I mean, you say these problems are going to take 10 or 15 years. Part of the problem is we should have started trying to plan for these kinds of supply shocks that we're seeing now, pandemic, climate change. I do think it's likely that we're going to be seeing more of these, and the long period we've had of continuous growth, continuous increase in prosperity, although very unequally shared, certainly, maybe not coming to an end, but certainly changing, sort of slowing down, and we're going to see more and more rolling shocks from climate, from weather, from drought, from fire, Migration puts lots of political pressure, and we're not, in my view, seeing it managed well in the UK, where I am. We're seeing, I think, unpleasant populist backlashes against refugees and migration, some of it driven by climate shocks. So these are huge problems, and a lot of it is political as much as economic.
Yeah, great to get your thoughts, Joe. Really appreciate that. Joe Michell there from the University of West of England. That was very interesting indeed.